He lives in you. Reflecting on what Rafiki has stated regarding Simba's father, that he'll always be with him in spirit. And that sad line of dialogue becomes the opening song to the Disney sequel, The Lion King 2, Simba's Pride. After the major success of The Lion King in 1994, a sequel was pretty much bound to happen, especially as the mid-90s would usher the age of straight-to-video sequels from Disney Toon Studios. It was a notorious time before the ushering of the Disney live-action remakes. But The Lion King 2 Simba's Pride managed to exceed expectations and has been cited as one of the best entries out of the whole batch. Some have even liked it more than the first release. I kid you not, that's a big statement that I will have to address. The funny thing is that as a kid, I never expected a sequel because I wasn't sure where the story would continue after Simba conquered his inner demons and took the throne. And lo and behold, the next story becomes a welcome addition after the first movie. But how does it hold well in the test of time? What is it that sticks out from the entire batch of straight-to-video releases? Why would some like this more than the first movie? These are the questions I'll give my best to answer as I continue reviewing these entries. Proceeding where we left off, welcome back to Returning to Pride Rock. So many Disney sequels were often looked at as a cash grab of what's already successful, a desperate attempt to gain a quick buck by extending a story that's already had its loose ends tied together. True, there are some new narratives that can bring new challenges after the original story, but for the most part, you can tell no one was trying in a lot of these sequel titles. Taglines like, an all-new movie, with no indication of how good it may be, and most of the time they were just lazy afterthought narratives that were too disconnected and unnatural. So what made The Lion King 2 stand out well? The best way to answer this is identifying what is beneficial in preceding its original story. In this case, as the first movie still does a good job standing on its own, this entry utilizes what's already familiar, but it takes the right liberties that complement the differences that can be pieced together naturally as a distinctive option. It sounds simple on the surface, but it's delicate to think about when you base it off of previous events. Providing what's already familiar, the movie is yet another coming-of-age story as it begins with another opening musical with no dialogue, that being He Lives in You. Much like The Circle of Life, this opening track is very beautifully composed that works well with the setup of the opening. It's not as iconic as The Circle of Life is, but it's what I appreciate about this song. It has a slight mellower tone that still manages to be grand. As the movie begins, in fact, the music fades in instead of having a big call from the choir. It silently builds up, and it fits with the opening in a different fashion. We see the rising sun again, we see the wide scope of the Pride Rock again, but with the acknowledgement of knowing what we're coming back to. Along with that, seeing all the returning characters, including Mufasa in the sky, and what they're willing to bring new to the audience. It's familiarity that eases our way into the next chapter. And what does this next chapter provide? Territorial disputes, rebellion, identity conflict, and the nature of past grudges. Comparatively, when the first movie began, we were first introduced to Scar and Mufasa before we saw Cub Simba. This sequel, however, jumps into the plot as we're introduced to Simba once again and his daughter Kiara. Much like the first movie, Matthew Broderick returns his role for adult Simba, as well as the remaining cast who is brought back. Moira Kelly, Nathan Lane, Ernie Sabella, Robert Guillaume, and James Earl Jones. The only actor who didn't reprise their role was Rowan Atkinson as Zazu. Anyway, now that Simba has gained the throne of being king, he's now faced with trying to be a good parent on top of trying to be a good king. Most of the movie presents him as being an overprotective helicopter parent, such as sending Timon and Pumbaa to chaperone Kiara, and even breaking a promise and forbidding her to hunt or leave Pride Rock. But this is all at the expense of his past life. Considering how he grew up in contrast to how a cub would have normally been raised, he is faced with trial and error in both these areas. It's unknown territory to him, and is unsure of whether or not he'll endanger anyone. It's another obstacle of insecurities that put him to extreme measures that would later challenge others. Once again, it's him being his own worst enemy. This effectively makes the narrative more connected to the original as the obstacles are utilized by what's done in the past. This is very clever for Simba's character, and it's what I mean when I say the sequel takes the right liberties. It's well crafted, and it's still rewarding to proceed onward after the first movie if you're still curious. And mind you, he isn't even the main character. That goes to Kiara. As a cub, she is voiced by Michelle Horn. Her screen time here is short, but she is an adorable thing that just loves playing. As an adult, she is voiced by Neve Campbell. Yes, you heard that right, Sidney Prescott from Scream. Kiara has a similar formula as to how Simba was written, but with some changes that brilliantly create a wonderful contrast that complement each of their entries. They're both chosen as the next ruler, having their experiences of exploring forbidden territory, encountering danger, and getting scolded by the parental figures afterwards. But in Kiara's case, she explores by curiosity instead of proving her bravery, manages to escape by aid, and she isn't excited at all about being the next heir to the throne as Simba was as a cub. This to her is all work and chores, which is a dramatically different perspective. It's another way to relate to the viewers effectively as to how exciting it is controlling a kingdom, thinking you can do whatever you want. Kiara just wants to have fun with her life, without being held down so much, some of which comes to her being rebellious and disobedient simply because of it. It's obviously at the expense of Simba's mishandling of fatherhood, but it delivers a different spin that connects our main protagonist to the viewers who may not have had the same connection to cub Simba. As his was learning how great power comes great responsibility, Kiara resonates with struggling to enjoy life and wanting the stressful weight off her shoulders. Now, does that mean that kids should shrug off responsibilities and not be as rebellious as she has? Of course not. Kiara knows her moral standards.
Let's get out of here. We'll run away together and start a pride all our own.
Kovu, we have to go back.
You're kidding, but we're finally together.
Our place is with our pride. If we run away, they'll be divided forever.
And she does have a point. As rebellious as she can get, this is a conflict that has to be resolved. You can't run from your problems, something her father once learned that Rafiki knocked sense into. Aside from the frustrations with her father, she is also in a struggle with the star-crossed relationship being developed. By explaining this relationship, we jump to Kovu, who is our second main protagonist, and is a part of the Outlands. These Outlanders are a group banished by Simba as they are a new threat to the kingdom. Kovu, in that regard, is raised to avenge Scar by killing Simba, brainwashed in this perspective of pure hatred. However, after managing his way into the Pridelands, he learns the values of Pride Rock and discovering how wronged he was when earning Simba's respect momentarily. By doing so, he's given time with Kiara, moving from teaching hunting lessons to understanding the purity of enjoying life. By this point, he's heavily conflicted with his identity by how he was raised. Because of what Kovu learns and the conflicts he's faced with, this relationship between him and Kiara is developed much better than Simba and Nala's. Granted, Simba's circumstances were different, but there's no contest given the amount of screen time for Kovu and Kiara. I hate to say this as it is a cliche of a claim, but Kovu is a rather complex character. He's raised to be fierce and villainous, but learning the errors of his ways very quickly, he questions his livelihood and wondering if he has any chance to truly redeem himself. This can be heard very dramatically by the voice talent that was Jason Marsden, who was also the voice of Max in the Goofy movie, and later the American role for Haku in Spirited Away. And speaking of who else is casted in Spirited Away, we come to our main antagonist, Zira, the leader of the Outlands. She was voiced respectively by Suzanne Plachette, who would later play Yubaba. On the surface, Zira is a typical villain you'd see on a Saturday morning cartoon where she expresses pure hatred on the main protagonist. But holy crap does she have a lot of fun. Unlike Scar, Zira is incredibly over the top. She's very violent, brutal, crazy, and overall determined in what she wants. Imagine a much more psychopathic version of Ursula from The Little Mermaid, but injected into this lioness. Along with that, her song My Lullaby defines her character way too well at how batshit crazy she is written.
The sound of Simba's dying gasp. His daughter squealing in my grasp. His lioness's mournful cry. That's my lullaby.
Yeah, these lyrics are her bread and butter in her dialogue, and it's fucking glorious. Out of the whole soundtrack, this is the most intense song that competes well with Be Prepared. But what especially works for the song and her character is that it roots back to the themes of past grudges. Because she was banished by Simba, she developed pure hatred for him. It's pure vengeance and spite where she feels wronged. And much like Scar, this would become her tragic downfall, a lost cause as she refuses help that Kiara offered near the end of the movie before falling into a ravine of logs, crushed to death underwater at her own expense. Yeesh, talk about a painful way to go out. Now, since I recently mentioned My Lullaby and He Lives in You in the beginning of this review, I'm going to be going over the rest of the soundtrack as it's a surprisingly good list. It arguably doesn't match up with the first since they aren't as epic or iconic, but they do such a good job in comparison to the entire straight-to-video sequel batch. The issue I had with their musical counterparts is that they felt crammed in or they felt like they were pulled to a halt. They felt very unnatural, and listening to them felt like a chore. With the exception of one, The Lion King 2 doesn't do that. They serve their purpose with the narrative as effectively and as fluent as the original. They're catchy and even do a better job standing on their own. I said before that the songs in the original were difficult for me listening to them on their own merits, and much preferably I like listening to them through the movie. When listening to these songs though, they're much more individualized and not overly integral to the narrative. I won't say it outdoes the original soundtrack, but it does polish other areas that was weak in the original. We Are One ranks up there with He Lives in You as another wonderful song, this one being about the importance of family. The lyrics are an insightful exchange in dialogue from Kiara and Simba regarding her place as future queen. Each lyric provided shows how much Simba cares for Kiara, proving how much he's trying to be a good parent for her. This would later establish what Kiara learns when facing Simba with reason over the war with the Outlanders.
As long as you live here, it's who you are. You'll understand someday.
A wise king once told me, "We are one." I didn't understand him then. Now I do.
Much like He Lives in You, We Are One has a nice mellow tone, and in addition has a nice African vibe with a catchy melody that represents its own orchestral theme. This is what makes the soundtrack exceptionally well, sticking to its ethnic roots to help you identify with the set location. This is a big thanks to composer Nick Lenny Smith. While Hans Zimmer didn't compose for this movie, Nick has been in several collaborations with him, including The Lion King. Other works with Hans include The Rock, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Mission Impossible 2. So with that in mind, it shows what Nick was prepared for, and thus providing a solid soundtrack for a Disney sequel. I honestly don't have much to say other than the composition is lovely and the lyrics are deep and integral for Kiara. Not One of Us, however, is something I have more to say. It has a very unique way of how it plays out. Instead of having main characters sing about their turmoil or motivation, it's sung by the entire kingdom's animals, all the while expressing feeling betrayed, angered, and taken advantage of. And we see it in all directions in the moment when Kovu is being kicked out. At the same time, it's heartbreaking for both Kiara as she feels separated permanently, and Kovu now being a rogue with no place to belong as he is also turned by the Outlanders. There's a lot of weight happening in this song. It's also on top of the fact that it's just as catchy as He Lives in You. Whenever it comes to the soundtrack, this song was definitely one I can never forget. Love Will Find a Way unfortunately is forgettable, as it holds a difficult position for me to say. On the one hand, it does do its job lyrically expressing how much there's a bit of hope after reaching the lowest point. It has a nice ballad sound you'd hear from the many romance songs in the late 80s, but compared to the rest of its soundtrack, it doesn't stand out for me. The chorus isn't as catchy or as impactful as it should be, especially when you consider the circumstances they're both confronting. It also doesn't help that the song was a bit short-lived as it ended with the second chorus. In this circumstance, you kinda need a third chorus. Even Can You Feel the Love Tonight did that. If there's any suggestion I would give, let Kovu have more screen time given how much of a rogue he's become, along with how much Kiara means to him more. Let him sing solely on the chorus, and then have them both sing harmoniously after finding each other. This would be more balanced and much more rewarding in contrast to the earlier events. Love Will Find a Way isn't a bad song, far from it, but it honestly feels a bit rushed and unfinished. And finally, there's Upendi. This song unfortunately lands as my least favorite. To give credit where credit is due, however, it's nice that Rafiki gets his own song. In fact, he gets a bigger role in this movie compared to the first, and all the more, this has a nice upbeat tune and provides a fun sequence for kids and telling the viewer, hey, these two are made for each other. But that whole purpose is where the song falls flat. We already know this as Rafiki was suggested earlier in the movie by Mufasa's spirit. We already saw the interactivity by these two where they developed chemistry. And while Kovu's dealing with his identity crisis, it's an obstacle in which both he and Kiara work together on later in the film. I mean, for Christ's sake, they worked together in escaping from a pack of vicious crocodiles when they were cubs. That alone is a possible foreshadow for these two. Because of every one of these moments mentioned prior, Upendi's overall purpose is so non-existent that it puts the movie in a major halt. And that sets a bad example of what a musical does. Musicals are made for a character's expression of anything integral or a major point to what they're confronted with. But they're often perceived as a chore where the story has to stop for the attention of whoever becomes the frontman of whatever song they're going to present. Upendi easily proves that later half, and it doesn't resonate well with me. I'm sorry if I'm sounding like a killjoy. Upendi's uplifting nature is what's fun about it, but it's fundamentally broken. And that's not the only thing of what is fundamentally broken. There are issues with the film in which, by comparison, is actually worse than the first movie, most of which is to do with the rights of the characters. They're underused. As we have Zazu and Nala, they're barely used for anything as they have little screen time. With Zazu, he's only there just to be the king's major domo. Granted, he didn't have much to work with in the first movie, but I guess this is why Rowan Atkinson didn't bother reprising his role for this one. Nala, on the other hand, had so much more to work with, and yet she's left in the background. The issues I had with Nala in the first movie is that her role was used very minimally. Within her use though, she was played up as the voice of reason, and it was an effective use based on her circumstances. Here it is used again, but she has much fewer lines than she did in the first movie. This would have been a perfect opportunity for her to play up her role in attempting to reason with Simba a lot more harshly, and even trying to comfort Kiara's turmoil. During Not One of Us, we see a shot where Nala is devastated by Simba's rash decisions, and it would have been a great way for her to play it up. But no, she's just there. It's frustrating because she is a good character. She just isn't fully utilized. Now, there is something that I don't have as much of an issue with, but I do have to acknowledge it as some people addressed this to me before. And that's regarding Kiara. Some have stated that she gets whiny or that she acts like a drama queen. To an extent, I can see where they're coming from. Lines like,
Daddy, this has to stop.
yeah, a line like that is easy to jab at, but that's mainly because the dialogue in the entire movie is subpar in and of itself. That's a more legit issue I have with this movie. The frustration that she brings has more to do with Simba's expense, as I addressed earlier, and for that, I don't take it as big of an issue. It may not be as big of an obstacle as Simba had, but I found it understandable on her behalf. It's trying to take control of fixing a problem. I will admit that Campbell could have used a bit of improvement when voicing the character. However, if you want to talk about characters who complain a lot, here's Kovu's brother, Nuka. Oh dear god, do I hate this character so much. He's voiced by Andy Dick, and his character is in this position of trying to impress Zira and others around him. At a young age, he wasn't chosen to partake in regaining the throne of Pride Rock, as Kovu was. So throughout the movie, he feels like a reject who can't be taken seriously. And it's easy to see why.
Oh, who cares? I should have been the chosen one. I'm the oldest, I'm the strongest, I'm the smartest. Oh, these termites! Sleep, you little termites!
If Kovu was so special, why does he need us? I never even had a chance.
This kind of role is meant to be played up as someone who you would have an emotional attachment with, so much so that he dies struggling with what he wanted to accomplish and becoming a drive to separating Kovu from the Outlanders. It's meant to bring an impact to the final act, but with him acting like a buffoon and a klutz, whining about his jealousy and talking behind Kovu's back throughout the movie, there was no connection I had with him. At best, he's annoying. At worst, he's spiteful to Kovu. And at most middle ground, he's written inappropriately as comic relief, scratching off termites, burning into a ring of fire, and having his face blown by directly staring into a geyser. No wonder why no one takes him seriously. So when he's killed off, I don't have any impact at all. I know that it's admittedly cruel to say, but if I'm supposed to have feelings for him, I would suggest not making him act so spiteful behind Kovu's back. I know I'm gonna get garbage for saying this, but this character is a mess. From where he stands, Nuka is easily my least favorite character thus far. The other character I would have loved to have seen used more is Vitani. Unlike Nuka, she's very level-headed and has a much closer connection with Zira doing her job. And the sad thing is, she isn't used as much as she deserved. She was so underused that the voice actress wasn't even credited. The character is voiced by Jennifer Leon, and she has been in some pretty big shows of the 90s, specifically Star Trek Voyager and the animated Men in Black series. Vitani was a much more interesting character, but much like Nala, she was left in the background. At the very least, she had some moments for the plot. And finally, we're cutting back to Zira. While she's a fun villain by her brutal and violent nature, her entire motivation is the most fundamentally broken aspect in the entire film. Her whole focus is wanting to take the throne and run it the same way Scar did. The problem with that is how his power was so poorly handled in the first movie. He didn't know the proper ways of running a kingdom.
Everything's destroyed. There's no food, no water. Simba, if you don't do something soon, everyone will starve.
Where is your hunting party? They're not doing their job.
Scar, there is no food. The herds have moved on.
No, you're just not looking hard enough.
It's over. There is nothing left.
And this was so apparent that even the hyenas were able to pick up the pieces.
Scar, there's no food, no water.
Yeah, it's dinner time, and we ain't got no stinking entrees.
It's the lioness's job to do the hunting.
Yeah, but they won't go hunt.
What exactly does Zira expect to gain grasping the throne again when Kovu's given the torch? And what kind of accomplishment is there when Scar's ruling the kingdom? What was it that Zira loyally admired so much about in his leadership? Because these are never explained, her motivations are counterproductive to what is beneficial for everyone else. I would presume that this is just plain rash in her drive and that she's just crazy for Scar. But if that's the case, it's a shallow reason. This not only weakens her character, but it also weakens the entire plot of the film as it's a crucial drive. All these issues I have is mainly because of the limited runtime. Comparing it to the first, it's about 7 minutes shorter. Now, I can't really debate on whether or not it would make a difference if there was more time because 7 minutes can only do so much. As obvious, the length is also in part with its budget. I mean, you look at the animation alone and it's a dead giveaway since the colors are much more washed out with some occasionally thicker outlines. In discussion of the animation, by the way, I find it playing its part to the mellowness like I've mentioned with the music. The lighter shades of sky colors and a bit more pink and purple. It's quite a contrast complement to the gorgeous scope of the first. By this point, I'm starting to repeat myself, but it's once again being its own entity. I know that sounds like a shallow reason as to why I appreciate the animation here, but at the very least, it's a step in the right direction when looking back at the previous straight-to-video sequels, like The Return of Jafar or The Enchanted Christmas from Beauty and the Beast. Disney Toon Studios would later step up their animation quality in films like Bambi 2 or Lady and the Tramp 2, and let's not forget a later entry in this franchise that'll be tackled on at some point. But until then, the final set of characters left for me to talk about is Timon and Pumbaa. I said before that these two are a preferred taste, but they definitely did their part when needed. In doing so, it wasn't too reliable on toilet and burp jokes, even though there are a few here and there, but rather some reference jokes that got me chuckling. For instance, there was a moment where Timon inadvertently takes credit for Pumbaa's idea. This happened in the first movie where Pumbaa suggested to raise Simba, only to be rejected and regained by Timon. It's an ideal way of playing stupid without realizing it. You'd think Pumbaa's dumbfoundedness would be taken advantage of, but Timon is completely unaware of what he's thinking of half the time. The same thing applies for when they suggest Kovu to help out their territorial dispute with a set of birds. Another moment I loved from them is when Timon is suggesting the cliche of when he's being held back.
Why, I oughta... Let me at him! Let me at him! Here, hold me back. Okay. Let me at him! Let me at him! Okay! I think you're missing the basic point here.
That is hilarious. I love it when a trope or a cliche is turned in on its head and becoming its own spin. They don't have as much screen time as they did previously, but they're still nice to have around. Nathan Lane and Ernie Sabella, you guys still did not disappoint. So even with some serious flaws, it doesn't take away the fact that you can still gain a lot from this. And of course, when watching this, knowing that it's a straight-to-video sequel, you pretty much know what you're in for. But despite all that, it does its job connecting to the first and inventing new obstacles off of it to which would be naturally fitting. This is what I mean when I say that this entry utilizes what's already familiar, but taking liberties that complement the differences that can be pieced together, as well as being distinctively optional. And I respect that. Instead of trying to outdo the original or carelessly piece together a lazy script, there's something to be connected with here. But even with that in mind, there is still a lot of room for improvement. So, here's the final question. Why would some like it more than the first? It's a bit of a tough answer for me to give because I much prefer the first release for its epic presentation and the thematic risks it took by comparison. The Lion King 2 doesn't have that, nor should it though. And the funny thing is, I used to forget this movie years after I got the VHS copy while I was still a kid. And much like the other sequels, I immediately had that mentality that, because it was a Disney sequel, it automatically wasn't a good movie. However, I picked up words from others who I've encountered over the years, and that they actually found this entry to be an exception whenever the topic was brought up. Given what others have said, it seemed to be very believable over time. And that's where I was convinced to have more food for thought. And of course, there were other exceptions of the whole Disney sequel lineup. Bambi 2 was a movie that I loved watching as it respectfully filled in the gap of the first movie between his fawn and adulthood. I've been hearing that Cinderella 3 was hysterical to watch. But The Lion King 2 not only became a good exception, it actually did something that the first movie wouldn't have had. At a time when I was rewatching The Lion King in my high school years and reliving my nostalgia, I would give time to watch the sequel and having its own appreciation. Hilariously enough, the sequel was released on DVD the same year as another special edition, and happily my parents bought me a copy. It was awkward to say the least, but like I said, appreciating films that were geared towards a younger demographic was something I was too insecure in being honest with. Regardless, aside from the obvious solid soundtrack and a better executed romance, I love the fact that a lot of these actors would reprise their returning roles, despite being big named. And despite having to struggle with the new characters, I love that there were additional characters period, and along with that, their own big names as well. Nowadays, big-name actors would be pulled into voicing a lead role for a marketing tool, and it would devalue what you would find surprising if you were to look up who voiced who. But with The Lion King being somewhat of a magnet of big names, it wasn't the selling point, and I like that. So with a bigger roster the sequel had, despite its major drawback, it became a blessing in disguise. It encouraged me to grow a fascination of piecing together these two movies as one historically admirable timeline because of it. It's kind of silly in hindsight, but that's also why I kept it in my head for a while. But as I turned 17, I then realized I wasn't the only one having this in my head. I would later discover that there was a fan base on multiple platforms like DeviantArt. A lot of art dedicated to The Lion King with some original characters the artists have thought of, otherwise known as an OC. This, believe it or not, was the first time I discovered what a fan base was, way before Bronies and before I learned terms like Trekkie or Whovian. The sad thing is, however, there wasn't really a nickname for fans of The Lion King, or not at the very least that I know of. But if I were to give it a name, it would be PRIDELANDER. It has a nice ring. This is something that the first movie didn't do. The Lion King 2 sort of invented a lore, given the batch of characters for another generation and formed its own universe. I'm not saying that this is needed, but it's nice bonus material for those who really appreciated the first movie. The more obviously doesn't mean the better, but if this is why some would like it more than the first, I can get behind that. The first Lion King will always be something I cherish, but I have a bigger appreciation for the sequel than I had before. It's way far from being as good as the first, but it definitely holds a special purpose, and that I'll always be grateful for. For what it has brought us, The Lion King 2 Simba's Pride will always be one of the most worthy straight-to-video sequels. Well done, Disney. Well done. And so we come to a close as we approach a prequel and a TV pilot for me to tackle. But for now, this is where I end the chapter of Returning to Pride Rock. Until next time, this is GoldenFox, and take care.